What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA
Thursday, March 11th.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Okay guys, we have an 11-game slate tonight, so let's take a look at the point guard position. I like Shake Milton from the Philadelphia 76ers playing the Chicago Bulls, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing point guards, Shake Milton has averaged 22.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 25 minutes per game with a 24% usage rate. He scored 19, 35, and 29 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 28, 29, and 31 minutes. He's projected at 23.3 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's 5.5 times value because he's only $4,200 FanDuel salary, but he is $1,100 more on DraftKings. So I love that FanDuel price. This is probably a FanDuel play for me only. He would need about 26 fantasy points to get 5 times value or more on DraftKings, but I think he can crush value here on FanDuel. So Shake Milton has scored 11, 28, and 6 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Bulls, but he's been on fire lately, so I like Shake Milton here versus the Chicago Bulls. Okay, another point guard that I like is Elfrid Payton from the New York Knicks playing the Milwaukee Bucks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing point guards, Elfrid Payton has averaged 23.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 45 fantasy points in 35 minutes last game. Looks like he came back from injury. He's playing well, and he's projected at 26.7 fantasy points here tonight. Now on FanDuel, that's 5.4 times value. He's only $4,900 FanDuel salary, and he's $700 more on DraftKings. So again, I prefer that FanDuel price. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 223 points scored in this game. And Elfrid Payton has scored 41, 13, 37, and 52 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Bucks. So that's fantastic player versus team history. So I like Elfrid Payton here versus the Milwaukee Bucks. Okay, now a value play for you. It's a high risk, high reward play. I like Tomas Satoransky from the Chicago Bulls playing the Philadelphia 76ers, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing point guards. Tomas Satoransky has averaged 17.6 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 21 minutes per game with a 14% usage rate. He scored 11, 15, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 20, 19, and 20 minutes. So he hasn't been playing very well lately, but he is projected at 18.6 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.3 times value. He's only $3,500 FanDuel salary and the same price on DraftKings. Now, Tomas Satoransky has scored 15, 28, 19, 34, and 16 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the 76ers. So that's pretty good player versus team history. So I like Tomas Satoransky as a nice value play, high risk, high reward, tournament play here versus the Philadelphia 76ers.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won, and then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. I like Paul George from the LA Clippers playing the Golden State Warriors, who have the 12th worst defense overall, and they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Paul George has averaged 40.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 29% usage rate. He scored 45 and 35 fantasy points in the last 2 games, playing 38 and 37 minutes. He's projected at 41.1 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.3 times value. He's $7,800 FanDuel salary and $700 more on DraftKings. So I love that FanDuel price. He scored 39, 39, and 27 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Warriors. Not great player versus team history, but if he can put up 40 fantasy points, which he did pretty much 2 out of the last 3 games, he would get you over 5 times value on FanDuel. So I like Paul George here versus the Golden State Warriors. Another shooting guard that I like is Tim Hardaway Jr. from the Dallas Mavericks playing the Oklahoma City Thunder, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Tim Hardaway Jr. has averaged 24.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 18, 25, and 16 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 23, 31, and 22 minutes. He's projected at 21.9 fantasy points here tonight. On FanDuel, that's 5.3 times value. He's only $4,100 FanDuel salary, but he is $800 more on DraftKings, so I love that FanDuel price. Now, he scored 25, 19, and 32 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Thunder. It's a great matchup, so I like Tim Hardaway Jr. here versus the Oklahoma City Thunder. Okay, if you're looking for a value play here, take a look at Ty Jerome from the Oklahoma City Thunder playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing shooting guards, Ty Jerome has averaged 19.2 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 25 minutes per game with a 14% usage rate. He scored 4, 23, and 19 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 19, 28, and 29 minutes. He's projected at 19.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.3 times value. He's $3,600 FanDuel salary and $300 less on DraftKings. And he scored 23, 8, and 21 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Mavericks. So he's going to be a hit or miss player, high risk, high reward, but his salary's low enough. He doesn't need much to hit value. So I like Ty Jerome here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. I like Nicholas Batum from the LA Clippers playing the Golden State Warriors, who have the 12th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing small forwards. Nicholas Batum has averaged 22.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 12% usage rate. He scored 24, 21, and 18 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 30 minutes in each of those games. He's projected at 21.8 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.3 times value. He's $4,100 FanDuel salary and $400 more on DraftKings. He scored 32, 21, 27, and 19 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Warriors. So I like Nicholas Batum here versus the Golden State Warriors. Another small forward that I like is Garrett Temple from the Chicago Bulls playing the Philadelphia 76ers, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Garrett Temple has averaged 19.2 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 14% usage rate. He scored 21, 19, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 36, 23, and 31 minutes. He's projected at 20.3 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.2 times value. He's $3,900 FanDuel salary and 100 more on DraftKings. He scored 28, 17, 9, and 19 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the 76ers. So this is a high risk, high reward tournament play. So I like Garrett Temple here versus the Philadelphia 76ers. Another small forward that I like is Chris Middleton from the Milwaukee Bucks playing the New York Knicks, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing small forwards, but Chris Middleton has averaged 37.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 25% usage rate. He scored 42, 36, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 39, 29, and 32 minutes. He's projected at 38.4 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.1 times value. He's $7,600 FanDuel salary and 700 more on DraftKings. So I love that FanDuel price. He scored 34, 26, 45, 32, and 38 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Knicks. But if you take a look at his last 5 games overall, he's been really consistent, scoring 35 to 46 fantasy points in his last 5 games. So I think he makes a really nice cash game play and a good tournament play, especially on FanDuel. So I like Chris Middleton here versus the New York Knicks. Another small forward that I like is Brandon Ingram from the New Orleans Pelicans playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Brandon Ingram has averaged 39.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 35 minutes per game with a 28% usage rate. He scored 43, 29, and 37 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 24, and 38 minutes. He's projected at 38.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $7,700 FanDuel salary and 700 more on DraftKings. So once again, I love that FanDuel price. Now, Vegas thinks there's going to be 239 points scored in this game, so we got a super high scoring game, and he scored 34, 38, 37, 56, and 33 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Timberwolves. So that's pretty decent player versus team history. It's a fast-paced game and a great matchup. So I like Brandon Ingram here versus the Minnesota Timberwolves.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. I like Jared Vanderbilt from the Minnesota Timberwolves playing the New Orleans Pelicans, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Jared Vanderbilt has averaged 19.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 19 minutes per game with a 13% usage rate. He scored 11, 12, and 31 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 17, 15, and 23 minutes. He's projected at 24 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.6 times value. He's 4,300 FanDuel salary and 200 more on DraftKings. So this is another high risk, high reward tournament play. If you're looking for value in a high scoring game, and he scored 38 fantasy points in his last game versus the Pelicans, it's a great matchup. It's a good way to get some cheap exposure to this high scoring game. So I like Jared Vanderbilt here versus the New Orleans Pelicans. Okay, another power forward that I like is Jay Crowder from the Phoenix Suns playing the Portland Trailblazers, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Jay Crowder has averaged 21.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 23, 22, and 4 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 23, 35, and 26 minutes. He's projected at 22 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.5 times value. He's only 4,000 FanDuel salary, and he's 700 more on DraftKings. He scored 15, 44, 10, 29, and 16 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Portland Trailblazers. I think this is another good tournament play for FanDuel. And the reason I think he's a good tournament play, he's kind of boom or bust. You know, he's going to get you somewhere between 30 or 15 fantasy points. So he could make or break your lineup here between 15 and 30 fantasy points. He's got a great matchup. So I like Jay Crowder as a tournament play here versus the Portland Trailblazers. Okay, another power forward that I like is Tobias Harris from the Philadelphia 76ers playing the Chicago Bulls, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing power forwards, Tobias Harris has averaged 37.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 43 fantasy points in 38 minutes last game, and he's projected at 36.3 fantasy points here tonight, which is 5.3 times value. He's 6,900 FanDuel salary, but he's 1,200 more on DraftKings. So I think that's a smash FanDuel price. I'm definitely going to play Tobias Harris on FanDuel. I think that price is way too low. And he scored 43, 23, 28, and 28 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Bulls. Although that's not great player versus team history, I just don't think you can avoid that low FanDuel price with that 40-plus fantasy point upside. He's a pretty consistent player, so I like Tobias Harris here versus the Chicago Bulls. Okay, moving on to the center position. I like Kelly Olynyk from the Miami Heat playing the Orlando Magic, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing centers, Kelly Olynyk has averaged 23 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 26 minutes per game with a 17% usage rate. He scored 41, 29, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 36, 22, and 24 minutes. He's projected at 24.4 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.4 times value. He's 4,500 FanDuel salary and 600 more on DraftKings. Now he scored 16, 25, 24, and 8 fantasy points in his last 4 games. So I think you got like a 50-50 chance of him getting you 5 times value or more. I think he makes a good FanDuel play. So I like Kelly Olynyk here versus the Orlando Magic. Now another center that I like is Al Horford from the Oklahoma City Thunder playing the Dallas Mavericks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Al Horford has averaged 31.4 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 28 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He scored 21 and 23 fantasy points in his last 2 games, playing 29 and 24 minutes. So he has underperformed his season average in the past 2 games, but he's projected at 31.2 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.3 times value. He's 5,900 FanDuel salary and 300 more on DraftKings. He scored 21, 39, 17, 37, and 20 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Mavericks. So I like Al Horford here versus the Dallas Mavericks. Okay, another center that I like is Wendell Carter Jr. from the Chicago Bulls, playing the Philadelphia 76ers, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing centers, but Wendell Carter Jr. has averaged 27.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with a 19% usage rate. He scored 34, 14, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 27, 22, and 24 minutes. He's projected at 27.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.7 times value. He's 5,300 FanDuel salary and 700 more on DraftKings. So I like that FanDuel price. I'll probably avoid Wendell Carter Jr. on DraftKings, but I think he makes a pretty good FanDuel play. So I like Wendell Carter Jr. on FanDuel here versus the Philadelphia 76ers. Now, if you're looking for a decent DraftKings play here at the center position, take a look at Rashaan Holmes from the Sacramento Kings, playing the Houston Rockets, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing centers. Rashaan Holmes has averaged 30.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 29 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He scored 41, 30, and 33 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 29, and 33 minutes. So he's been on fire, and he's projected at 35 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.1 times value. He's 6,800 FanDuel salary, but he's 300 less on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. And he scored 28, 49, 36, and 44 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Rockets. So that's excellent player versus team history. So I like Rashaan Holmes here versus the Houston Rockets.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.